Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm in conversation with bestselling author, publisher, and family man Jason Pinter. Jason is the author of two critically acclaimed thrillers featuring vigilante mom Rachel Marin, who will do anything to protect her children. She debuted in last year's Hideaway and returns in A Stranger at the Door, which was published in January. Jason's previous works include the five-book Henry Parker series as well as a standalone The Castle, which together have sold over 1 million copies and been published in more than a dozen countries. He has also written the middle-grade adventure novel Zeke Bartholomew Super Spy and the children's picture book Miracle. A graduate of Wesleyan University, Jason held editorial and marketing positions at Warner Books, Random House, St. Martin's Press, Grove Atlantic, and the Mysterious Press. In 2013, he founded Polis Books, an independent publishing company, and in 2019, he introduced Agora Books, a diversity-focused imprint devoted to crime and noir fiction. Jason makes his home in New Jersey, where he lives with his wife and their two young daughters. This domesticity has clearly inspired the Rachel Marin thrillers, as you'll soon hear. Speaking of which, A Stranger at the Door has proven a worthy successor to Hideaway, earning starred reviews from Booklist and Publishers Weekly. The latter noted, "Outstanding. This powerful family values thriller is a convincing, moving performance." Now, Jason Pinter reveals just how he captured that authenticity of action and emotion in a candid conversation about his multifaceted career. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Central Booking. Today I am in the virtual company of best-selling author and celebrated publisher Jason Pinter, whose new book is A Stranger at the Door, and it is out right now, this very moment, from Thomas and Mercer. So, hey Jason, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure, and I have to tell you, and you're probably going to laugh at me, but I have finally reached the point where I've read both of these Rachel Marin books, and I can see her as a character other than Whitney Houston in The Bodyguard, and I don't know, and it took me a little while to get there just because, well, I liked that movie, so the name's always been in my head, but I don't see Whitney Houston anymore, so win for you, I think, is the author. Right?
I think so. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I have no idea. Like, was her name Rachel Marin in that movie? I'll be totally honest with you. I did not know that.
No, I figured. Only I would know ridiculous things like that. But I feel like, after spending a couple books with her, like we have a rapport now, and I don't hear "I will always love you" or any of that anymore.
The truth is, when we lived in Hoboken, there was a street that was running perpendicular to where we lived called Marin Boulevard, and I just, for some reason, that as I was writing the book, that name stuck, like Marin, and it became Marin. That's where it came from. And then Marin County, obviously. So I legitimately had no idea about the Whitney Houston connection. So
No, that's awesome. You're exonerated. We believe you. That's just me. But anyway, so I sort of mentioned that A Stranger at the Door, it's your second thriller to feature, vigilante mom Rachel Marin. And I just wanted to ask you, can you tell us quickly, sort of about the opening murder, which is really creepy. There are some elements to that that'll just make you think about answering the door. But tell us about that and how it sort of necessitates Rachel's involvement.
Yeah, so in Hideaway, which is the first book, we're introduced to Rachel Marin, who's a single mother who, after a traumatic event kind of shattered her family, had to move with her two young children to a small town in the Midwest in Illinois. And she sort of intended to keep her head down. She sort of had honed her mind and body to become a protector to her family because she felt sort of let down by people who were supposed to protect her. So basically, in Stranger at the Door, she sort of found a small amount of peace. She's working as a consultant to the local police department. But then her son's teacher is found brutally murdered in a pretty horrific fashion, to the point where it's clearly not just a murder, but it's also meant as a message. So Rachel has to get involved to find out not only why was this guy murdered, who killed him, why was he killed in such sort of a gruesome fashion. It was obviously meant to sort of deter some people from revealing some secrets that they knew. So of course Rachel has to get involved, and then just to balance sort of being wanting to sort of get justice, for the same time her children are, because it's her son's teacher, her children end up in the crosshairs as well. So that's what I love about the character, sort of the dichotomy between essentially investigator and mom.
Sure, sure. And we're going to come back to that, I promise you. But I wanted to ask you too, there are people who sort of hesitate to jump into a book if they know it's, the second or third and it's not the beginning. So I'm wondering, for those people, can you tell us how this book does present a standalone story? And then obviously for returning readers, how it will also, satisfy them. And for you, is it a challenge to balance the two without worrying about narrative momentum or losing that?
That's a very tricky balance when you're doing a series, because I think you sort of have two ways about it. You can do sort of like the serial way, and I would look at like Dennis Lehane's Ken G. Gennaro series, where there are 5 books. Then Moonlight Mile came, I think, like 10 years later, which are sort of a serial. And that each book they're more fulfilling if you've read the prior books, and sort of the characters bear scars from each book in each subsequent book. So that can be tricky because you want a reader to be able to pick up book 4 in a series and dive in if they haven't read the other ones. But at the same time, if readers have read the first 3, you sort of want to give them a sense of this is an ongoing story, and they might feel a little more satisfied with the things that happened in the first few books come to roost in later books. And then you sort of go the opposite, which, like, let's say like Lead Child or the Jack Reacher series, which are phenomenal. But, you could pick up book 19 and it's just the same thing. Reacher, he owns a toothbrush and a change of clothes and goes from town to town, and that's pretty much it. So Stranger is a standalone. If you haven't read Hideaway, I think I give just enough of Rachel's backstory that you can get a sense of who she is and why she is where she is without needing to read the whole book. So it is, I did mean it to be an enjoyable standalone. But if you read Hideaway, there are characters and situations and scenarios that happened in that book that you will understand maybe to a fuller degree if you've read Hideaway first. There are characters that sort of came back from that book, or situations that are alluded to from that book. So it's a tightrope, and I try to walk it well, and that to give people a standalone to read and enjoy, but allow people who read Hideaway to maybe get a bit of a deeper understanding.
Sure, very well put. And I will say, having read both, you can absolutely enjoy it as a standalone, but you do get a little bit more, of the depth of backstory and character development having read both. And I did want to return to Rachel for a minute, if you don't mind. We sort of talked about how she's a vigilante of sorts. Can you tell us a little bit more, about her backstory and how that necessitated sort of a new identity, and also what her transformation was?
Yeah, so basically at the very beginning of Hideaway, and literally the opening chapter, her husband is brutally murdered. And it changes her life, it shatters her sense of peace. And then for reasons that I sort of don't want to go into too much because I want to get into spoiler territory, she is forced to move with her children to a small town in Illinois, and she's forced to take on a new identity. And these are things you find out reasons for in the book. But basically, she feels like she's been let down by the people around her. She could have been protected, and for various reasons, they either failed in their duties or refused to do their duties. And she realizes that if it comes to protecting her children and herself, nobody is going to do the job that she can. So we learn early on that she's also sort of very smart and very capable, sort of maybe put some of her ambitions on the back burner when she became a young mother. But once she realized that she has to be this protector, she dials it to 11 to become a protector to her children. So hones her mind, hones her body, maybe to an unhealthy degree. Rachel, one of the things I like about Rachel is that she's not fully emotionally stable. She maybe hasn't fully dealt with the trauma that she's experienced, that she spent so much time becoming this protector that she's neglected the emotional component of that. And I really like exploring that, especially in the second book, that plays a part. And then how does she sort of balance? She's become essentially this weapon. But the problem is, like, a weapon, unless it's used, just sort of sits there. And Rachel's not the kind of person who, even if she says she wants to sit there, maybe she's looking for a reason. There's even a chapter very early on in Hideaway when she is sort of, the wrong person picks a fight with her, and you see what happens to it. You see what happens there. And Rachel sort of always has to pull back a little bit because she may be a vigilante, but I don't think she sees herself as a vigilante. I think she just sees herself as someone who wants to do the right thing, even if it means doing the wrong thing.
Sure. And that lends itself very well to my next question for you. I did want to ask you about that because, some people see the world in black and white, and then others see the gray areas. And, I think we live and inhabit a lot of different gray areas. But is it difficult to have, a character who readers need to be able to relate to and root for, who does things at times that people might not approve of? Like, what is the balance for you? How far can you
Mm.
stretch her? And when do you know to walk her back so that you don't lose your readership?
Well, I think she's relatable. She's a parent. As I started writing this book shortly after my oldest daughter was born, so I want to say 3.5 years ago or so. Of Hideaway, I mean. And I don't think I could have written it before I became a parent, just because there are certain, to me, emotional components to that just resonate in a way that I didn't understand before I became a parent. So with Rachel, I think she's relatable because her base goal, when it boils down to, is protecting her children. I think any parent can relate to that. I would take a bullet for my children. 99% of parents would do the same thing. Rachel would take a tank missile for her children. But at the same time, she doesn't go about it the right way, necessarily all the time. She sometimes can provoke confrontation but I think it's also in Rachel's world, we all live in gray. But to Rachel, because she's been the victim of pure evil, she sees the world as people who are on her side or people who are not on her side. And she would rather assume you're not on her side and protect herself and her children rather than risk that 1% chance that she's wrong. And if it means going too far to protect herself, I think she's justified that because, the ends justify the means. They don't always, but I think to her, it boils down to, is this going to protect my children? Is this going to protect my family? If so, I'm willing to go a little too far to do that.
Sure.
And I do think that helps keep Rachel relatable because she is willing to do anything to protect her family, as are most of us, even if we're not all doing the same things that she does.
Right. I'm like, I like her. I don't know if I'd want to meet her, in a dark alley if she had
No,
any
no,
reason to
no.
question
Yeah.
my character whatsoever.
Yeah.
And most people just looking at me question my character. But, so let me ask you this too. We've talked about Rachel as a protector, and in A Stranger at the Door, she's really in a position where she begins to suspect that her son, Eric, is sort of being used as leverage against her, and their relationship is already, a bit tense. He's a teenage boy. He's,
Yeah.
suffered a trauma that she did as well, and then this kind of takes that to a whole new level. So can you talk about the dynamics of their relationship and how this
Yeah.
sort of escalates that exponentially?
Yeah, I think when I talked about the emotional component of the trauma, that gets to the very heart of it, because Rachel experienced this trauma and her son experienced it just like her, maybe even a little harsher, as you see at the opening of Hideaway. And before this trauma, he was sort of like a very outgoing kid, very smart, very personable, had a lot of friends, and he's very much withdrawn since then. And whereas Rachel has given up her life to be able to protect him, kind of on a physical sense, she maybe hasn't really figured out how to protect him on an emotional level. That he's become so withdrawn, and she kind of doesn't know how to reach him. And I think that's in part because she hasn't dealt with her own trauma on an emotional level. And basically, once Rachel starts to investigate this murder, like you said, somebody who may be behind it realizes that they can use her son as leverage against her. That if they sort of, there's this sort of, I'd say, sort of charismatic businessman, sort of like a Gordon Gekko meets a Ponzi scheme type guy named Bennett Bryce, and he has ties to the murder in ways that we don't really get to later on. But he realizes that if he starts to bring Eric under his wing, he can essentially use he'll use Eric as leverage against Rachel to say, like, listen, you push this further, we have your son on an emotional level, and we can make him do things that, and I think because she's such a protector of him, that creates this real emotional conflict for her, and that she sees if she pushes more, it could put her son in danger. But if she pulls back, he's going to stay withdrawn forever. And how does she manage that? How does she reach her son during a time when he's the most vulnerable?
Absolutely. And all right, I have to ask you too about Rachel's daughter,
Hmm.
Megan, who's just like, a really well-adjusted, well-behaved, creative being. And I think that, well, one of my favorite parts of the series is her character, and she's a writer herself, these adventure stories about, Sadie Scout. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's a really like enjoyable aspect of the
Yeah.
books, and it really does provide a little bit of levity too.
I love that stuff. And, I think that came from, when we meet Rachel, her son Eric, I want to say he's like 6.5 or 7 in the first book. And Megan, her daughter, is an infant. I think she's like 6 months old or so. So then when we see what's happened to Rachel, it goes forward about 6 years. So basically, the bulk of the story and then Stranger takes place when Eric is, I think, 13 or 14, and Megan is around 6.5 or 7. And whereas Eric experienced this trauma firsthand and it has colored his life, Megan was really too young to know what happened. She didn't witness any of it. She was 6 months old. She met her father, but how many memories do you have from being 6 months old? So, whereas Eric has become very withdrawn because of this, Megan hasn't, because she really didn't experience it firsthand. So, she is sort of like, she knows her mother's a single mom. She knows she doesn't have a dad. She used to have a dad, but she doesn't have the memories and she doesn't have the trauma. So she is sort of mostly a happy-go-lucky, cute kid. And she writes these sort of adventure stories called Sadie Scout, which is sort of like a little kiddo superhero that I think I have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, and these are kids that like, it's a character that all kids around that age could love. So I love that Megan essentially is writing these little books about sort of a superhero. And in a way, she sort of sees her mother as a superhero too. So that was a little bit of a chance to create some levity, create some joy, show Rachel being just a mom proud of her kid who's writing these stories, but also really show the difference between Eric and Megan, the two kids, and that how withdrawn Eric has become because of this, and then how Megan has sort of been able to adapt to a normal life. And I think Rachel sees Megan and what she can do, and she wishes Eric could have some of that lightheartedness.
Sure. And so I have to ask, I mean, I'm sure you're not trying to create even more work for yourself, but have you ever thought about, spinning off Sadie Scout into an actual series for children?
I think maybe when my daughter's old enough to read the books, I'll tell her now. It's one of these, like, I actually debated that when I was done writing this book. It's like, oh, maybe there's sort of like a cute little promotional way we could write little sort of Sadie Scout chapbooks, and just like any other marketing idea, just sort of like filed away somewhere. It's certainly a cute idea, and if a reader wants to write little Sadie Scout books, or if my publisher eventually wants to do little Sadie Scout marketing postcards or something, that's certainly a cute idea. I love those books, and certainly I could see them becoming a real thing at some point.
Awesome. So, all right. So I do want to ask you, you talked a little bit about fatherhood, and I did want to ask you because parenthood is obviously, paramount to these books. And so, and you've talked about this a little bit, but if you wouldn't mind expanding on that, can you talk a little bit about how being a father has influenced, the stories that you tell, the emotional truths that you tell? And
Yeah.
maybe, if you wanted to take a moment to talk about your wife as well, because she gets a beautiful dedication in this book. For Dana, warrior, protector, mother, wife, it begins and ends with you, which I think is fantastic. But I think, not only do you get to see how life has changed you being a father, but you get to see how life has changed your wife as being a mother. So what are you able to take from that reality and put into your fictional world?
Yeah, part of the inspiration for the book actually came directly from something my wife said, and this was around the time that our oldest daughter was about 6 months old. And like every parent, we kept a baby monitor in our room so we could, make sure that our daughter Ava was sleeping, make sure that she was safe. And around 6 months old, she sort of passed the point where like she's really in danger when she sleeps. But I remember my wife used to watch the monitor like all night and she wouldn't sleep. And I slept pretty well because I'm a doofus. But I remember at one point I stupidly said to her, like, why do you watch the monitor all night? She's safe, like get some sleep, because I'm a moron. And she said something that I'll never forget, which is basically, you'll never understand what it's like to grow something inside of you, then have it exist outside of you, and then not know whether it's safe at all times. And that really kind of hit me. And that was Rachel to a T. And just that she has these children who every mother wants to protect their children, but now dial that to 11 with Rachel because she couldn't protect them from something terrible. And I think that emotional connection with my child really helped me understand that obviously I'm not a mother, but I'm a very hands-on father. I take pride in that. And I think that emotional attachment to my children, understanding what it felt like to want to protect your child and to know that you can't always protect them. You can't wrap them in bubble wrap their whole life. You can't, at some point they're going to be playing by themselves, or they might go off to school or college. And you're not going to be with them 24/7, and you just pray the world treats them well, because some things are out of your hands. And that's sort of like, that's what Rachel's struggling with, in that bad things have happened to her family that were out of her hands. So then she tries to take as much into her hands as she can.
Absolutely. All right. So before we sort of move into broader territory, if you don't mind, I did just want to ask you one more question, sort of about Rachel. And I wanted to ask you about her relationship with John Serrano. And again, you don't have to be, overly specific if you don't want to be, but he's a detective that she meets, in the first book, and they sort of bond together. And he has a really, interesting past himself, but also, professionally, he works within law enforcement. So can you
Mm-hmm.
talk about how his experiences, personally and professional, both sort of help to ground their relationship, but
Yeah.
also complicate it?
Yeah. So, when we meet Rachel in Hideaway, she's very distrustful of law enforcement for very legitimate reasons. You'll sort of find out, you see pieces of her backstory sort of come together in Hideaway, maybe even more so in Stranger at the Door. But she's very distrustful of law enforcement. And when there's the murder in Hideaway, the former mayor of the city, Constance Wright, is found dead. It's originally thought to be a suicide. Rachel believes it was murder. And so she starts investigating, and she starts to butt heads with the two detectives who are investigating the story, and John Serrano and Leslie Talley. But it's very important to me that that Serrano and Talley weren't just sort of stereotypical cops. They weren't like, either stupid or aggressive or just bad at their jobs. I wanted them to really be people. And so it was very important to create backstories for both Talley and Serrano. So we learn about Talley, we learn about her. She's married to this woman, Claire. Claire was previously married and has 3 children from her ex-husband, and Talley has adopted them. And Serrano went through a really terrible tragedy of his own. And I think it's because of that tragedy that Serrano went through that it sort of cracks Rachel's facade a little bit, because she's so distrustful of law enforcement. But when Serrano starts to reveal what happened to him, Rachel's able to see him not as a cop, but as a man, as a person. And I don't want to go further without spoiling anything, but that sort of melts the ice a little bit, and she sees him as a human being. And it was really important to me to not only create well-rounded characters in these cops and have them have real stories, but to give Serrano an aspect to his character that would reach Rachel in a way that he wouldn't if this thing hadn't happened to him. And that sort of connects them in some way, this sort of shared trauma. And it was really interesting to explore that.
Sure, and it's kind of fun to watch them too, just because sometimes she has to work outside the law, and he really can't because that's
Yeah.
his occupation. So it's a really interesting dynamic between them that
Yeah.
I find enjoyable. But anyway, so I guess to sort of broach broader territory, I did want to ask you, and looking back, you've been at this for a long time. You had a multi-book Henry Parker series. You've done a standalone middle grade books, a children's book, lots and lots of, nonfiction pieces for various forums and publications. So can you tell me what has changed for you? Have your creative ambitions changed at all? The stories that you're telling, how have you evolved, from...
Well, I think, looking back at the Henry Parker series, I mean, I think both these series, both the Henry Parker series and the Rachel Marin series, were written. They're very much connected to the periods in my life. I think the Henry Parker series, I think I wrote that book when I was like 25, give or take. And the character of Henry Parker is a young man around that age. And I think there were aspects of being that age that were very clear in Henry. There was both a sense of ambition, a sense of like having a bit of a chip on his shoulder. When you're 25 years old, like, you want to be the president of the company, and you think you want to run the world, and you have anger at anyone who might be holding you back, as did I. Like, I think I was like, an assistant editor or something along those lines, and I was like, I should be promoted every single day. And there's a sense of like, you want to move forward very, very fast, but you also don't really have any baggage at that age, or most people don't. So I thought it'd be interesting at that age when I was writing the book to I felt like in most mysteries and thrillers, the characters tend to be sort of like older middle-aged dudes with like, paying alimony and child support and drinking problems, and like they're sort of misanthropes, like the kind of guys who go out and like close down the bar at 3 a.m. and get into alley fights. That wasn't Henry Parker. Henry Parker was 25 years old, trying to make his way as a reporter. So I thought it'd be interesting to write a character that you could see him accumulate some baggage over time, rather than sort of the baggage being there already in book 1. And I thought that was different. With Rachel, I started writing the book when I became a parent, and like I said, I don't think I could have written it before I became a parent, and it was written at a different point in my life. The same thing. I don't think I could write Henry Parker now because I don't have the emotions I did at 25, and I could not have written Rachel when I was 25 because what the hell would I have known about raising raising a child and protecting a child? So I do think there's a very clear, thorough line in this series between writing characters that are sort of very similar to the points of where I am in my life, and I enjoy that because I think it gives me a little more clarity and introspection to the characters.
Sure. And so I wanted to ask you too. So I mentioned at the beginning that you are also the publisher of Polis Books. Some great books. I have to tell you, like one of my favorite books from recent years is Ain't Nobody Nobody by Heather
Oh
Harper.
God, I love that book. Yes,
Phenomenal. And I have a Megan Holloway sitting in my virtual cart that I
yeah.
just have to press click on so that
Oh,
it'll
yeah, Megan's fantastic. Yeah, yeah, and she has a new one coming out this year too.
Yeah, that's what I heard. So I said we have to cook something up for that. But I wanted to
Yes,
ask you,
yes.
why did you decide to, start your own publishing company, and what can people expect from, the books that come out on the Polis imprint?
So I've basically been working in publishing on the professional side since college. My first job out of college was an assistant editor at Warner Books, which is now Hachette Book Group or part of Grand Central. And then I went to Crown Three Rivers, which is a division of Random House. Then I was at St. Martin's Press. Then I was at Grove Atlantic Mysterious Press. And I think all along, God, this is going to sound so conceited, but I wanted to say like the buck stops here. I wanted to have a final say in what I published and how I published it. And when you're working in professional publishing, as wonderful as a lot of those experiences were, and a lot of my colleagues were, you really can't acquire anything without a million people signing off on it. You can't design covers or marketing without a million people signing off on it. And sometimes there are times when you're passionate about something and it's just you're either not allowed to acquire it, or it's not, the cover isn't the way you sort of think it should be, or the marketing isn't there. And not because people always want to do badly, but just like anytime there are that many cogs in place, not everyone's gonna be on the same page. So I wanted to sort of have a final say in everything. I wanted to be able to publish the books that I wanted to publish. I wanted to publish books that I didn't think other people were publishing. And that's, I think, what I try to do with Polis is, publish books that are, for whatever reason, the big five aren't picking up on. Maybe the characters are different, or the authors are different, or it's a different kind of voice or a different kind of setting, or something that is maybe a little too dangerous or out there, and say, listen, we don't need to sell 50,000 copies to be profitable. And I think that, unfortunately, the way corporate publishing is, it's sort of like, unless we can sell this many tens of thousands of copies, it's literally not worth it because the overhead is so high, or whatever. That we can say, listen, our expectations are modest. We want the books to do well, but we can take more chances. And I think in a book like Ain't Nobody Nobody, which is, like you said, was one of my favorite debuts we've published, the writing is so good. And it's weird, but it's this brilliant sort of weird book. It's like sort of police procedural, but not really. And it's also hilarious. And it like feral hogs. I mean, there's a book featuring feral hogs. But to me, it was the kind of book, like, I read it and I'm like, I don't know how a big five publisher would publish this, but I know how I would. And I think that's how I look at anything we publish and say, like, I don't need to look at how they would do it. Like, I can fit a niche, and I'm okay with that. And obviously I hope our books sort of branch out and hit an audience well beyond a niche, but I'm positive for a book like Heather's, there will be an audience for it. And if somebody else isn't willing to find that audience, then hopefully I am.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I remember reading that book and thinking this voice is so distinctive and different and funny. Like, how can this be your first book?
I know. It's the kind of book, like, it's the kind of book that as a writer you read that as the first book and you're just like, I hate her. Like,
Yeah.
like how could she be this good on her first book? Like, this must be her 18th book. But it was like that kind of voice, and it was like almost on a sentence level. It was so funny, but it also had this like human empathy too. It was just brilliant in every way.
Yeah, it was great. It was one of those books like I put down and I was like, I love her, I hate her, and I'm never going to try writing fiction again, because how do you live up to that?
Exactly.
But let me ask you too. So, you've been on both sides of the industry. You're still on both sides of the industry because you are an author, you were a publisher. How has being a publisher, has that changed the way that you look at the craft of writing, and sort of how do you, reconcile your own creative ambitions or your authors with the fact that at the end of the day, publishing really is a business and there are those considerations as well.
I think working on both sides, I have a lot of empathy for my authors because I go through things that they do. Like every author has, unless you're like, John Grisham, you have concerns and anxieties about your career. Like, is my new book going to do as well as I hope it will? What about my next book? Will I be able to publish a book beyond that? And I've been through all of that. So I think when my authors have those kind of fears or anxieties, I can understand that on a real empathetic level because I've been there. I think as a writer, being a publisher, or more specifically being an editor, because my first job was editing. Obviously I do a lot of the operations side right now, but like I still like, I literally used to use the red pencil to mark up manuscripts. Now it's all track changes. But I think that makes me a lot better in my own work because I can be very critical. I think there are a lot of times like an author will like write a first draft and say, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Whereas like, okay, here's the first draft. Now the real work starts. And I can take that sort of critical look. And, before Hideaway came out, I probably did like at least 10 full drafts of that book, top to bottom. Same thing with Stranger at the Door. And there does certainly become a point of like exhaustion, like, God, I have to read this again. But at the same time, like, even on the 10th draft, like you'll find things that you missed, even if it's like switching this word here or chopping up this sentence into two sentences, like you will continue to find things. And I think that being an editor and publisher does help me have that sort of critical apparatus.
Sure. All right. And so I have to ask you, very uncertain times that we've all been living through. So how has the pandemic changed your work life? And how have you endeavored to try to adapt to the new normal, whatever that even is?
I mean, that's like the question should be the opposite. Like, how has it not affected my work life? The pandemic has changed everything about how I work. I used to be in an office and, be in an office 10 hours a day. Now with the pandemic, we have two small children who have been sort of in and out of school for the past couple months, but who were home over entire summer. And, my wife and I both work full time and now share an office space in our house. And I went from 10 hours a day by myself, being able to concentrate to like now, on a good day, I'll have 5 or 6 hours before the girls get home from school. On a bad day, like if the girls are home, it's like a couple hours here or there in between madness. And you're always just exhausted. And there's often not enough time in the day to get everything done. And you sort of, you don't go to bed having accomplished everything. You sort of go to bed thinking like, oh God, now I have to go, this is just, I'll push off to tomorrow. So it's been very, very difficult from a work perspective. But at the same time, like a lot of people have it way worse. Like everyone's healthy. Our kids are healthy. They've been able to be in and out of school a little bit, but it's changed how I work, everything. And especially from the publishing side, like it's affected the supply chains. It's affected printer turnarounds. It's affected every aspect of what we do. Like there are no more in-person events. We had a book come out last year, a phenomenal debut novel called Line of Sight by James Quealy. It's a great sort of PI novel. And it literally came out the week the pandemic really took off. I think the pub date was like March 13th or something. Mm-hmm. So like right as things exploded. And I think we had like 10 or 15 events scheduled with James. He's a reporter at the LA Times. So like he had all these events out in Los Angeles. And I think we're going to do something in Northern California. And literally every single one of them was canceled. So we had this book that was getting like starred reviews, a blurb from Michael Connolly, and we had all these events lined up, and then boom, it's gone.
Right.
And that as a publisher is just so disheartening because you have this book that you really think people are going to get behind, and then it's like a sinkhole opens up beneath you and there's nothing you could have done about it. And it's just, you have to roll with it, even during a terrible circumstance.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it's posed so many weird challenges, but it's also sort of forced people to be creative and seek out new opportunities, which I guess, is the upside of that. But I can't imagine, being on deadline and having children and lockdown and all those.
It's crazy. I just, to people to be on deadline and just like, you're trying to focus. In the meantime, you're hearing like, Daddy, I got to go potty. Daddy, I'm hungry. And like somebody like literally like little fist bang on your office door being like, Daddy, I want you. And you're like, oh God, like breaks my, like I have work, but it breaks my heart.
Yeah, oh, of course. You were human.
Yeah.
All right. So, and being respectful of your time, I have two more questions for you, and
Mhm.
then off the hook you are. But, for people who maybe aspiring writers or people who are just looking to reignite that spark, something I like to ask people who've been at this a while is, what is the best advice that you ever got in terms of, a creative life or writing? And then what is the best advice that you never got and had to discover for yourself and wish that maybe somebody could have cued you into a little bit earlier?
Oh man, those are good questions. The first one, I would say, if you're going to lead a creative life, be realistic about your expectations. I think there's this sort of expectation that, you write a first draft and the book is done, or you get your first book deal. I'm going to quit my job and write full time. And I think being smart about that and understanding the realities of the business, and it's a very volatile business, and not a lot of people can write full time and make a full time living off of it. Because you always had like, there are no guarantees. There's no guarantee if you get a first book deal, you're going to get a second or a third. So to think like, hey, I'm going to quit my job and have to figure out health insurance and all that, like it's a lot of people don't sort of think there's this sort of romantic notion of I'm going to be a writer and stay up late and sip tea or bourbon and then wake up early and the muse will drift down from the ceiling and come to me. It's like, no, you have to be realistic about what your expectations are, how your book is going to do, what to do if the book doesn't do as well as you would have hoped. Do you have something else in the works? And to know the industry. I think once you're a writer, you run your own small business. Like every single day, like I am tallying my sales and understanding how much money I'm making both this month. What am I going to expect to make 6 months from now? To budget, because for the most part, even if a writer writes full time, most of us aren't J.K. Rowling, and we were not making hundreds of millions of dollars. If you're making a living, good for you, but it doesn't mean you can be foolish about it.
Mhm.
So I think being smart about that, understanding the industry, and setting realistic goals so that you're not kneecapping yourself, and if in a couple of years things don't work out the way it you planned.
Sure.
And what was the second question was?
So advice that you weren't given, you had to sort of discover through trial and error and being in this
Right.
industry, and then you wish maybe, you knew it a little bit sooner than you did.
I think it sort of goes hand in hand with the first one, is that don't sort of don't expect the same thing to happen for book two as it did for book one, or book three as it did for book two. Certain books will perform and some won't, and it may be up to the whim of the gods and or things that are beyond your control. Um, so essentially, always hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Always be writing your neck. I always tell, like, if it's one of my weirdest little pet peeves is when an author writes and publishes their first book, and then I see them a year later, and I'm like, "Oh, what are you working on?" They're like, "Oh, I'm tinkering around with my next book." I'm like, "You should have your next book done by
Yeah.
the time this book comes out," because readers are very fickle. If you publish one book and your next book doesn't come out for 3 years, guess what? Unless you have won the Penn Faulkner, people are going to forget about you. Um, so always be prepared, not just like the next month, but the next couple of years. And I think that's something that, when the mark came out, I think I was 27, and like I think I was signed up. I think I had like 7 books under contract by the time I was 28. So to me, it was like, this is the greatest thing ever. But at the same time, like that comes to an end. Then you have to figure out what's next. So I think it's where you always need to sort of figure out what's next, and prepare yourself for that, because I think there's it's such a great accomplishment to both finish a book, get an agent, get a publisher. They can forget about what comes next. But you should always be thinking about that.
That's excellent. I know. I think the only, predictable thing about publishing these days, and probably always, is how unpredictable it is. So anything that you can do to set yourself up for some kind of success and stability, I think is great.
Yeah.
Final question to you. Can you leave us a little teaser? What can readers expect from you next? And this can be you, it can be from the Rachel Marin character. And if you want to preview anything that's forthcoming from Polis Books, please feel free to do that as well.
Yeah, so I'm hopeful that there'll be more books in the Rachel Marin series. I think it's like sort of like with anything in the industry. Like I think my publisher wants to see how readers respond to this, and then hopefully if it's well, it seems to be going well. there'll be more books in the series. I already know what book 3 would be. I have another book I'm working on that I sort of want to keep under wraps right now until I know what happens with it. On the Polis side, we have amazing stuff coming out. So we have 2 books coming out soon. Children of Chicago by Cynthia Pelayo, which is sort of this great sort of like Latinx final girls. It's sort of this great horror thriller and an homage to Chicago. We just published Tricky by Josh Stallings on the Agora side, which is sort of this great neurodiverse mystery by Josh Stallings, this acclaimed writer. We have a new Witch Cats of Cambridge mystery by Clea Simon, which is sort of this great fun, essentially traditional cozy series about magical cats solving murders. And it's just like, that's usually not my cup of tea, but that's why it works, because it's just so much fun, especially during a time like this. It's just like, you need that breath of fresh air. And then we have a great debut called At the End of the World Turn Left by Jana Slor. We have a new book from acclaimed author Kent Harrington. We have this great book called While Nobody Is Watching by Michelle Dunn, who was an actual soldier in the Irish Army. The author was herself, and her book is about a former corporal in the Irish Army. So it's based on her experience. So we have some amazing stuff coming out over the next couple months on the Polis side.
Wow, that's amazing. And I love that's what I love about Polis, is you never know exactly what you're going to get, but you know it's going to be pretty much unlike anything else.
I hope so.
Yeah. So, all right, everybody, the new book, Jason Pinter's A Stranger at the Door. It's out right now, and you should absolutely read it. Thank you so much for your time, Jason. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I enjoyed this. Thanks a lot.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.